NATO itself is a geopolitical fiction. Do we really believe that Donald Trump would deploy one US Marine to defend Latvia?
The Trump view is that he could do more or less what he wants, engage in any conflict, deliver any kind of blow, and then pull out at the time of his own choosing. He believes that his legacy will be a slightly larger United States. So it's not merely make America great again, but make America great.
Even if you're just going to have Darcy Rodriguez and others taking over, you have as the first item of business not de-Baathification, not de-Chavizification, but you have to get rid of the subsidies.
They're just still struggling to adjust to a world where the role of the US has changed so very much.
We have not had the sort of guns versus butter discussion that we should have had in Europe. What we've had is politicians still claiming that you can have your cake and eat it.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinninmont.
And I'm Arthur Snell, and this is Disorder.
A show where we try to provide a semblance of order amidst the disorder of our mad world. And as you can see, our job is becoming increasingly challenging.
It's also a show where we've enjoyed hosting live events with our partners here at the Royal United Services Institute. Today is our last such live podcast offering, and we're honored to be joined by Jonathan Eyal, Associate Director of the Strategic Research Partnerships at RUSI. Welcome to Disorder, Jonathan.
Thank you.
I can't wait to talk with the three of you about the potential threats to order and security on the horizon in 2026. But before we jump in, I think we should tell the listeners that Disorder is not a program where we try to avoid the 7,000-pound gorilla in the room. And in this instance, that gorilla is the US intervention in Venezuela. And how does it potentially change dynamics of protests in Iran, Chinese ongoing threats towards Taiwan, developments in Eastern Europe, peacemaking in Ukraine and Gaza, and even US saber rattling vis-a-vis Greenland? Therefore, given that we are speaking on January 8th, and this episode is going to drop shortly after that, we'd like to spend the first portion of our program assessing all of the aspects of what Disorder 2026 might bring with our Venezuela glasses on. They're going to help us order the disorder of the Venezuela intervention. And then in the second portion of our event, we will pivot to our regularly scheduled programming. In other words, threats to order emanating from the rest of the world. Then in the last portion, we are going to pivot to how Britain and global markets and institutions like the IMF and UN could potentially reassert order or be lodestars of alternative ways of doing things. Let's talk about Venezuela and the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, foolishly and moronically being called the Donroe Doctrine. Arthur, you have an excellent podcast called Behind the Lines, and not only out of professional courtesy do I listen to every episode. I enjoyed that earlier this week you had Catherine Royal, former UK ambassador to Venezuela, on your pod. This seems like a great opportunity for you to distill something like a potted history. How did we get to here? What's the background that prompted the Maduro raid? Who's Darcy Rodriguez? And then what I found most interesting in the conversation is what might be the role of the Venezuelan and Cuban diasporas in the US in influencing the ideology and the actions that allowed us to get to this moment?
Well, Jason, thank you very much, not least for that wonderful plug for this particular episode that I encourage you all to listen to. And good evening, pleasure to be here. Yeah, so Venezuela, obviously nobody here needs reminding of the extraordinary events of the last few days, but it's worth trying to go back a little bit in time. Venezuela very clearly is potentially one of the world's great oil-producing nations, but it definitely is not at the moment. That is one of many elements of this story which makes it both confusing, intriguing, and ultimately probably illustrative of what we have with Donald Trump. So if we go back, of course, we'll all remember the series of air raids that occurred, or airstrikes that occurred on small boats moving through the Caribbean region. Now, if you've lived, as I have, in that part of the world, you'll be very familiar with the kind of boat. It's called a pirogue. It's between 20 and 30 foot long. It has a lot of power in terms of it can move very quickly. But the one thing it can't do is go from Venezuela to the United States. So whether or not these boats, any of the boats that were blown up by the Americans, contained drugs, and of course that remains unproven, I think that there's no possibility that those drugs were about to be smuggled to America. What's interesting about Donald Trump is that whilst in some respects he doesn't have a very good reputation for telling the truth, in other respects he tells you exactly the truth. So after the apprehension of Maduro, of course there was a lot of talk about the illegal narcotics trade, but Trump spelled it out very clearly. He said, we're here for the oil. We're running the country and we're taking the oil. So that is at least what I think is in Trump's mind, because he seems very motivated by this. Now, of course, there are lots of issues with that, not the least of which is that Venezuela's oil industry is in a mess. Now, if as I have, you've worked in countries surrounding Venezuela that themselves have a big energy sector, what you do is you meet constantly Venezuelan oil executives, engineers, specialists, chemists, and so on. They've all left Venezuela because it's a place you can't work if you're trying to make a career in that world. So Venezuela's oil industry is in a mess, and it would take billions of dollars to make it productive. It would take billions of dollars at a time when perhaps the world oil industry was in the mood to spend billions of dollars. Now, any of you who've had the chance to check the oil price will be well aware that where it is at the moment is at about the lowest level it's been since COVID. So that there is no requirement for the oil that Venezuela produces. So I think one of the challenges with trying to understand what led Donald Trump to seize the president of Venezuela is that we can't put too much factual analysis on. We have to put a kind of psychological analysis. What is happening inside Trump's head at the point that he makes this choice? Now, one of the things I think is very clear is that he will make a lot of money from this. He's already announced that there's going to be a special fund controlled by him personally, which will deal with the oil that Venezuela gives to the United States, that the oil will be sold and spent solely on US products and services. Again, it's very obvious then that Trump has a lot of power over what those products and services might be, and clearly there would be kickbacks and other inducements for him. So I think we have to understand this in this very personalized sense. But I want to come on to your final point that you raised, Jason, about diasporas, because one of the things that's happening here is that different people in the administration in Washington have different objectives. So if we look at Marco Rubio, who has the perhaps rather unwelcome task of trying to put a kind of diplomatic gloss on a rather undiplomatic policy, he's clearly very focused on Cuba. His own heritage is obviously he's Cuban-American. There has been for a long time a very active and vociferous Cuban-American community, which is understandably very focused on unseating the communist regime in Havana. Now, of course, the communist regime in Havana exists at the moment mostly on the basis of economic support it's had from Venezuela over the years. So one can see there that a combination of what we call a Cuban-American and then a more recent type of American, which is a Venezuelan American, refugees from the socialist paradise of the Bolivarian Republic, are influential in the modern right wing in America. So that is one sort of pool of power. The other is, of course, Trump, who I think is more focused on a kind of personal sense of power. But then let us not forget also, finally, the kind of new imperialists that now exist in America. In particular, we see Stephen Miller talking about the power, the might of modern America, and the degree to which, if you read Trump's national security strategy from early December, this sense of spheres of influence, a kind of 19th century concept where the Western Hemisphere is America's hemisphere, it's for them to control, and by extension, other hemispheres, perhaps Europe, maybe under Russia's control.
And speaking of spheres of influence, that leads us to the Donroe Doctrine. I want to ask you, Jonathan, do you think that this is a serious concept, this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? And what do you see it meaning for Venezuela, Panama, Greenland, Cuba, Colombia?
Well, I mean, it's definitely a serious concept in his mind. So, as we've just heard, we should, the mistake that we could make is to try to substitute our own logic for the logic of Mr. Trump. So, in his perspective, I think it's fair to say he told us the story straight away. He said it in his inauguration speech on the 20th of January last year, that he wanted Greenland and that he quoted the Monroe Doctrine directly, and he renamed a few mountains in Hawaii as part of it. And it was very clear from the beginning that he believes that his legacy will be a slightly larger United States. So it's not merely make America great again, but make America great. So in that respect, he definitely believes in it. But I think there's enormous question marks about how much he could make it stick with, because let's not forget, the Trump view is that he could do more or less what he wants, engage in any conflict, deliver any kind of blow, and then pull out at the time of his own choosing. I question that assumption. So, for instance, in the case of Venezuela, he's engaged in regime decapitation. He's left the entire structure in place, including all the unsavory characters. How long can that continue? What happens, for instance, if crowds of ordinary Venezuelans get onto the streets? And the authorities do what? Shoot them, and then what? How long can this continue in this particular way? So I think we're having the first iteration of this. And I'm not sure how much the entire American structure buys into this argument. I would suggest we should take it with a very large pinch of salt, this stuff, because it's not going to be the kind of earth-shattering change of the kind we believe. Let's face it, whether the Russians or the Chinese violate international law is not dependent on whether the Americans violate international law.
Jane, how do you see the role of the UN and the international community and other actors, such as potentially Britain, in standing up for Greenland in any meaningful way? Might this Venezuela intervention actually be a watershed moment where, as it were, international law now bites back? Or would that be too optimistic because law doesn't have any teeth?
I think it is a watershed moment precisely because so many threats are converging at the same time. I think if this was just a matter of the removal of Maduro, it would be easier for Europeans to think, well, everybody loathes him, we can to some extent turn a blind eye, we're not directly involved. But obviously that's not the only threat. And what we're hearing from European officials is, of course, they're very nervous to say much about the obvious illegality of the Venezuela operation. And they are briefing that they are going to prioritize Greenland and Ukraine as places in their neighborhoods. But they know that all of these things are tied together. They're just still struggling to adjust to a world where the role of the US has changed so very much. In my day job, I'm the chief executive of the United Nations Association of the UK, based just round the corner from here. So it won't be a surprise to know that I am a fan of international law, but we need to think hard about what it is. It's not something like domestic law, and in a way, sometimes I think that terminology can be confusing because we don't have a global state that enforces law. Instead, it's a really messy business of contested and collective attempts to enforce it. International law has always been stretched, tested, and sometimes broken, including being broken by the US in the past. And it's not something that is going to be fully enforced upon the US, especially when so many people are afraid of how this Trump administration will react, even to quite mild criticism or people suggesting disinformation on X is bad or these sorts of things. But what will matter, for example, is what is the position that different countries, including the UK and Europe, take on the legality of the US running Venezuela when it comes to the role of international oil companies. Will it be accepted that these companies can trade in this oil, or will it be so politically and legally risky that that won't really work? I think that Russian and Chinese experts study very carefully what happens, what's done by the US, what are the legal justifications they use for it, what response do they get at the UN, and that Putin was very influenced, for example, by what he saw happening in Libya, which I would like to ask Jason about. But let's bring you in, Jonathan, since I've just challenged what you said.
So I don't think we disagree. I think first of all, on the subject of the lesson for others, I think the real lesson is the return of a discussion about spheres of influence. And the idea that spheres of influence is now a legitimate concept in international law. Let's face it, we were helping Ukraine fight precisely because they were standing up to an idea of a sphere of influence. And now you have the President of the United States saying that spheres of influence are not merely okay, but super fashionable. So in that respect, yes, I mean, there are the memoirs of Fiona Hill, who was President Trump's Russia advisor in the first term, and who said many years ago, 4 years ago, that there was a deal on offer by Putin of exchanging Venezuela for Ukraine. So the idea that you can do these deals and divide the world into spheres of influence is very much alike. And I would say, with hindsight, that's likely to be the biggest damage to the international system from what has happened over the last few days.
Then I can't resist a follow-up, because I can see the logic of this argument. What do you think it means for Taiwan, especially since Taiwan is not just China's neighbour claimed by China, but also so important for global technology? And we know the US is also obsessed with winning what it sees as an AI race with China.
So, I mean, we're all guessing here. My personal feeling is that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, will not launch an initiative or an offensive to take Taiwan unless he's quite sure about the American response, and he's quite sure that he could achieve it very, very quickly. It will probably start with a blockade in order to allow China enough opportunity to draw back if the American response is too strong. But what there is absolutely sure is that there is an enormous amount of interest in Beijing already. State-sponsored Chinese academics are already speculating about it, about the idea of doing a deal with the Americans, the old Chinese dream, that one part of the Pacific will remain under American dominance up to Guam, let's say, and then anything else that is further west from that will be under Chinese influence. So the language is definitely one that plays into Xi Jinping's idea that force is perfectly okay to use in order to pursue a sphere of influence. And the world needs now to be divided neatly into these slices.
It's the old world order, in a way, instead of the new. I'm interested, you mentioned China's thinking about whether a Taiwan attack would be quick, and you mentioned Trump's desire to have quick interventions that stops whenever he wants it. I think history is rather littered with predictions that a war would be started and won very quickly, and that often fails to pass. That brings us, Jason, to Libya. As the American in the room, what do you think that the US should have learned from the previous regime change operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and perhaps in Libya? And I'd like to hear, given your background and interest in Libya especially, some thoughts about those parallels. We're hearing a lot about Iraq just now. We're not hearing so much about Libya.
Great. Well, I don't think that we would be sitting here discussing the disordering implications of Donald Trump's presidency if it were not for A, the Iraq War, and B, the Arab Spring. And I've written about this in my book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. Trump is, of course, overcaused by many phenomena: the decline of US manufacturing, the hollowing out of the middle class, but very, very critical was the blowback against American adventurism in Iraq. And of course, he campaigned on America first. I want to take us down a little rabbit hole here of what I call semi-sovereign institutions. People tend to think of a place like Venezuela or Gaddafi's Libya as a socialist paradise. And I'm going to be writing an upcoming piece for RUSI about this idea. They're not really socialist paradises in terms of how their economies actually function. What they are is exactly the same of how the Soviet Union was before Glasnost and Perestroika began. You have different fiefdoms which are controlled by semi-sovereign economic institutions. And the Venezuela case and the Libyan case are actually the most they're actually the most similar. In what way, you may ask? In subsidies. So in Libya, a liter of high-quality refined petrol at the pump is less than 1 US cent per liter. So you're paying less than 1/100th of what you would pay in the UK for that. And that's exactly the same in Venezuela. In Libya, they subsidize basic food items from formula to grain and bread. And in Venezuela, they subsidize all of them. Where does this leave us? It leaves us with a situation that we had in Gaddafi's Libya and post-Gaddafi Libya, and that we have in Venezuela, where you have militia or gang strongmen. In Venezuela, they're called colectivos, whereby they exist to consume these subsidized assets and then traffic them abroad and make a 100-fold or 900-fold markup. If, in fact, we are going to see a regime change, meaning not just Darcy running the country now, but someone new, there's going to be a scramble to get your hands on these semi-sovereign institutional spigots, which are the preferential access to the subsidized goods. And in Libya, that's what gave rise to the militias. It was the payouts that you could get if you could get your hands on these things. So people have said, oh, but Venezuela, it's not Libya or Iraq. Venezuela lacks sectarianism, and it has so many Western-educated technocrats, and there's so many vast reserves of underutilized oil assets. Well, Libya lacks sectarianism. It's a 95% Sunni country. It's a 89% Arab country. They have a tremendous number of Western-educated oil engineers, and they had a lot of underutilized oil assets. Libya was producing 3.1 million barrels a day in 1970, and only 1.6 in 2011. That's exactly like Venezuela. They were producing 3 million in the past, and they're producing about 900,000, 0.9 now. So it's all the same situations, and the underlying economic structures, I think, are going to make it nearly impossible to have a decent transition if the people don't know what they're doing. What you have to do, and my talking point here is what we should learn is you get rid of the subsidies first. Before there's any transition, even if you're just going to have Darcy Rodriguez and others taking over, you have as the first item of business, not de-Baathification, not de-Chavizification, but you have to get rid of the subsidies. And that's what I said in 2012 when I was briefing US and UK officials, and they said, oh, that's just the economic stuff. The answer is that the economic stuff is why these regime types exist. So let's just say that I'm very worried because the security implications of these economic structures could blow up into a major militia sector in Venezuela.
Let me bring you back in, Arthur, and ask, how do you think Russia and China are going to respond, particularly in Venezuela? Chinese officials were meeting with Maduro literally hours before he was kidnapped, so probably feeling pretty humiliated. On the other hand, Russia might have bigger fish to fry closer to home in terms of Ukraine, and with Syria, it seems like what they've tried to do is basically work with the new guys so far. So what do you foresee?
Well, I think the answer to this question really does depend on whether actually Venezuela is regime change or, to use Jonathan's, I think, very apt term, regime decapitation. I spoke briefly to one of my cousins who's there in Caracas, who, you know, they're like many people from their background, they're very much anti the current regime, very hopeful for regime change. And they were already, I think, voicing a fairly common message, which is that we're seeing that Delcy Rodriguez, who is, you know, interim president, to those who are opposed to the sort of Bolivarian socialist regime, is really no different to Nicolas Maduro or Hugo Chavez. So that's a very important point for Russia and China. If Trump thinks that he can make the gains that he wants to make by dealing with Rodriguez, who's this interesting combination. people who know her say that she's both a pragmatist and an ideologue. And I think if you can sort of ride those two horses, you may be able to survive in this world.
I'm intrigued by that. I don't know how it works, but it's very
Well,
intriguing.
I think she believes fundamentally in the sort of socialist revolution, but she's somebody who, for example, has tried to tackle some of these economic, structural economic problems that Jason's talked about. She's somebody who clearly has found it possible to work with the US in this brief period that she's been in charge.
And maybe before.
Well, indeed, one can only speculate. But clearly, there were some high up friends helping the Americans as they came in. So I think Russia and China, and particularly China, where the interests are much more on the economic basis. And China, it's worth noting, China has made energy investments across the Western Hemisphere, particularly in South America. Again, this is not about the supply of energy to China. Most of these plants which they've invested in, or oil fields that they've invested in, are playing in the global markets. But this is about a global strategic perspective. I think for China, there is more to worry about, because actually this idea of spheres of influence doesn't really match the way that China has expanded into Africa, expanded into Latin America. I think for Russia, it's a bit different. I think the Russians may be prepared to conclude that if we're getting what we want in Ukraine, that, as Fiona Hill noted, it may be not welcome but acceptable that you lose a bit in Venezuela.
On that note, lose a bit in Venezuela. I'm interested in your thoughts as a panel. Might there be a situation where enemies of the U.S. would just support insurgent movements? The reason that the failure in Iraq was so spectacular was the Assad regime let insurgents, both jihadis and otherwise, use Syria as a base. And then the Iranians, of course, work with Shia militias. So who might want to say, well, we can take pot shots now at this new American empire?
I don't think that this is an immediate prospect for a number of reasons. First, let us not forget that there is a wave of right-wing electoral successes in large parts of Latin America, with the notable exception of Brazil, Argentina, Chile now, the last elections. So it's not that Trump is completely devoid of local support. Number two, it would depend very much on what happens in Venezuela. Personally, I don't believe that the American assumption that they could keep the lid on the politics of Venezuela has much chance of success. So it is possible that these militias scatter. You could have a guerrilla movement that could continue. But I think that you're talking about a number of years. For the moment, there's been quite a lot of defeat for Russia and China in the Venezuela case. I mean, the Chinese have about $75 billion worth of debts that are not likely to be serviced anytime soon. They were okay with that because they were getting cheap oil from Venezuela. They're going to be less okay with that if they're not getting that. I think one of the big questions if we look at it, I mean, we are obsessed with Greenland for obvious reasons, but I think one of the big questions is Cuba. I think this is where the center of gravity is moving. It would be an enormous advantage for Mr. Rubio if the Cuban regime was to collapse for his own electoral prospects at the end of the decade. And I think it's a big question because Cuba is knocked off its perch big time by what has happened in Venezuela. And I would love to see how Putin takes that one, whether he's prepared to give up Cuba as well, or whether they are likely to make a stand on this.
Now I want to talk Greenland, and I'm going to kick it over to the panel moving in this direction. How seriously, Arthur, a man with your background not only of reading personalities, but of doing diplomacy abroad, can you take it seriously when a leader says that he lusts after a given territory? I just want it. Mommy, I want my Greenland. I'm back in a second.
Well, yeah, I don't know how to respond to that. No, I think with Greenland, well, one thing is I go back to the point I made right at the beginning that Donald Trump doesn't actually hide his ideas and intentions. It's something that he actually spells out, and he spelled out his interest in Greenland more than 5 years ago. I don't think there will be a war because I don't think actually that Denmark will be prepared to send young Danes to die over a territory which, of course, is part of their kingdom, but its status is different. I don't think other NATO countries will be prepared to risk their own militaries there. But I do think what it tells us is that NATO itself is a geopolitical fiction. And I mean that in the sense that do we really, really believe that Donald Trump would deploy one US Marine to defend Latvia? I don't see that. And it seems to me that Putin probably knows that better than any of us here. But I'm interested, Jane, what's your view on this?
Well, on NATO, I think the interesting thing is that NATO's Article 5 has never really been tested. It's only been invoked, of course, by the US after 9/11.
Indeed.
And there's always been this element of uncertainty about not necessarily would you send a Marine to Latvia, but would you respond with nuclear weapons if Russia was to threaten an Eastern European country with nuclear weapons. So there's always been that element of uncertainty. And I think there's still some uncertainty there, which hopefully is enough to deter Russia from actually doing crazy stuff towards NATO members, which so far they have largely refrained from doing. They have been doing all sorts of hybrid things, but they haven't been doing anything bold and dangerous and horrible enough to prompt an actual NATO response. So I just feel maybe, I understand the logic of saying NATO's become a fiction, but I think it's a bit more ambiguous than that. Jonathan?
Well, I think one has to be very careful not to dismiss NATO as just a figment. The reality is that it remains the largest and most potent joint command, that it still has a large amount of troops. There's always been a question about how much the United States is prepared to risk its own territory to save the Europeans, or shall we say, sacrifice San Francisco for Sofia. So that has always been and will always be. I think the secret of NATO is to try not to pry too much into Article 5 and ought not to try to test it as much as possible. Can I go back to the initial question about Greenland? I think we need to have a bit of introspection as well. The reality is that, as documents recently released indicate, successive American administrations were worried about Denmark's hold on Greenland. The Danish discussion about giving Greenland autonomy and ultimately a guarantee that if it wants independence is going to get it was a worry for the Obama administration, and they have privately told the Danes about that. We tend to forget now, conveniently, that 2 years ago, the Danish government turned down the idea of a new international airport in Greenland, and it was the Chinese, if you please, who won the contract to establish an airport there, and it was pressure from the Biden administration that got the Danes to change the program. On the positive side, I completely agree with what was said. We live in a very weird world where it is even possible to conceive of an American invasion or seizure of the place. I also agree that nobody will fight for it. What I think may happen, if we have some reason in this nonsense, is that there may be a few additional concessions that could be offered to the Americans by the Danes. A serious discussion about security implications, a serious guarantee that Denmark would not allow Greenland to be independent, which of course is a very big problem for the Danes, but the reality is that. And perhaps even creatively thinking about sovereign US bases. After all, if Britain can run 2 sovereign bases in Cyprus on a perpetual basis written in the Cypriot constitution, I do not see why we can't give the Americans the possibility of a sovereign base as opposed to the real base now on there to allow Mr. Trump to claim that he's got at least a partial victory. I mean, that would be the way I would deal with it. I completely agree that this just feeds the beast. And in that respect, it's not a very honorable suggestion, but I live in the real world.
Moving on from part one about Venezuela and the Donroe Doctrine to our so-called regularly scheduled programming. Jonathan, let us talk about the challenges facing Eastern Europe right now. Firstly, what is the state of the conflict on the ground in Ukraine at the start of 2026? What's going on with the line of contact, with drones? What's going on with the American security guarantees that we've heard about, the French and British quote-unquote promising troops, and the on-again, off-again peace negotiations? Just easy questions. Give it to us in 90 seconds.
So, I mean, I think the security guarantees that the United States has offered, and we're back to security guarantees like Article 5 in NATO, again, are at the end a political gesture. The key element is, however, that we have succeeded in moving Trump along from the initial position, which was far worse for us. The sort of Google Translate proposal that he put to the Ukrainians, which was effectively a Russian proposal badly translated into English, is no longer on the table, at least in official terms. And Trump has accepted that although there will be no US boots as such on the ground, there will be an American commitment to help in case European troops come under difficulty. Yet again, you'll have all the questions that you have. How can you trust guarantees from this American president? But the reality is that the White House seems to have accepted that this is much more complicated than it initially assumed. My fear is that at the end of the day, it will be a sacrifice of Ukraine. We will package it in the most elegant way possible. Nobody will recognize the Russian seizure of about 20% of Ukraine's territory. But the reality is that the war, you mentioned the line of contact, the war is not moving in any direction. We are not able to inflict the defeat that we wanted to inflict on Russia. Russians are not able to erase Ukraine off the map. So everything points to a kind of a miserable deal that will be packaged as doing the best possible. I think the real question is what happens thereafter, and are we able, and this will be the story of 2026, are we able to maintain some consensus among the European countries as a whole to avoid recriminations and to try to keep defense as a multilateral project in Europe? Because the biggest danger that we have is that we will play straight into Putin's ideas by renationalizing our defense strategies, by doing all kinds of little pacts between us and abandoning the collective security idea as our fundamental driver of security on the continent. It's going to be a very tough one also because we're going to have a few elections that are going to test the balance of power in Europe. We're going to have local elections in Germany, which are going to result again in a very large rise in the Alternative for Germany. We're going to probably have parliamentary elections in France because I don't think this decrepit government is going to stay in power until 2027 as Mr. Macron wants. And of course, we're going to have elections, local elections in the United Kingdom where Mr. Farage may have his moment of glory.
Oh, just those tiny little bits of disorder that might happen in 2026.
But isn't there a counter-argument that this is going to be the time that Europe is pushed together, given both the threats from Russia, although they're perceived differently in different bits of Europe, but also the need to get some kind of independence from the US. I mean, I know they're an outlier among the far-right movements, but I found it so interesting that the French National Rally responded to Venezuela by saying sovereignty is paramount and essentially embracing the notion of strategic autonomy for Europeans.
Yeah, no, you're right. Although it is fair to say that anti-Americanism is it's sort of embedded in the French feeling. So, I mean, it's not surprising that Mrs. Le Pen was stronger than most others on this subject of sovereignty. But you're right. In many respects, there is a sort of consensus about a European. The Europeans must do the work on their own. The problem that I have is that the discussion is still not serious. All of our pledges to spend money on defense are based on mañana principle. Namely, we will change none of our spending priorities as far as social services are concerned, or the national health services, or everything else. Everything will remain unchanged. We will just borrow more money. The Germans promised to borrow €500 billion for this purpose. The French promised to borrow more, despite having one of the largest borrowing things. And we in Britain raid the foreign aid budget in order to spend a bit more by 2027, if you please. So the reality is the discussion about the European Fund for Rearmament, the fact that the Brits have been told that if they want to join this project, they have to pay into it. The ridiculous thing I saw at the beginning of this week, this idea that the British Prime Minister's suggestion of getting closer to the single market in Europe cannot be discussed because Europe is too preoccupied discussing its own rearmament, says an EU official. So Europe cannot talk to Britain because it's too preoccupied with defense rearmament. So the country with probably the largest capabilities in military terms is shunned to one side because we have to talk about ourselves. So what I'm saying is that, yes, there is a lot of lip service being paid to the idea of a European identity in defense. Yes, there is a consensus that we are on our own. But know that we have not had the sort of guns versus butter discussion that we should have had in Europe. What we've had is politicians still claiming that you can have your cake and eat it.
No one wants hard choices.
How do you see it, Arthur?
Well, I'm not going to disagree with anything that Jonathan said, but I think we should, I'm going to do something that I'm rarely accused of, which is be ever so slightly optimistic.
Heaven forfend.
I know, you'll kick me out, yes, if you'll allow me momentarily, because if we go back to the start of last year, of 2025, obviously Trump is inaugurated. He'd made it very clear during his campaign that he wanted to see an end to the war in Ukraine on terms that were favorable to Russia. And then, as Jonathan aptly described it, we had the sort of Google Translate written in the Kremlin proposal. But what makes it interesting is that the Americans are 0 from 3 in their attempts to give Ukraine to Russia. And that is because Europe has found a way actually to stand together. And Europe has discovered, there's many things it hasn't done, and we've heard about those, but Europe has discovered an ability to stand strong, and Europe, I'm including Britain in this, to bring to the front of the sort of argument people who have something to say that is relevant. Obviously, you have Britain and France, but let's not forget Finland, that both the personal relationship between President Stubb and Trump, but also the fact that Finland is a geographically significant country that knows a lot about dealing with Russia. So you have all these factors in the mix, and it seems to me that there are many, many things that we should be troubled about. But what is quite impressive is that with a US president who is very headstrong, very determined to help Russia to win the war in Ukraine, Europe has actually managed to prevent that happening on 3 very serious occasions. Yeah. And the evidence is that that will continue to happen.
Now, as all the mega orderers in the audience know, we at the Disorder podcast, which I hope you listen to regularly and will listen to regularly, we love solutions. And I think in 2026, actually, it really befits us to try and increase the amount of time and energy we put into sharing good ideas and proposals for how things can get better, because it definitely will be very easy to spend a lot of time assessing and expressing shock about the myriad problems. So let me start with you, Arthur. You talked about key European leaders coming together. What about the EU as an organisation? Does it have a meaningful role to play in defence and security, or is that mission creep?
Well, that, it feels like that's like a sort of classic. It's like sort of a golden oldie, isn't it? What is the role of the EU in defence and security? It seems to me that with the US clearly withdrawing from European security, I'm not saying this is a total and irreversible withdrawal, but it's clearly happening, that there must be a role there for the EU. And part of that is, of course, a role that includes Britain in some kind of partnership arrangement. Now, as Jonathan noted earlier, at the moment, that is very complicated. And this idea that the UK, that there were not terms available acceptable to allow the UK to participate in certain important programs, it suggests that it's not serious at the moment. But it has to happen, and of course it has to happen not least because it takes us back to this question of a post-war Ukraine and this question of integration, because the biggest risk, it seems to me, we can talk about Moldova, we can talk about relatively small countries on Europe's periphery, but Ukraine is a vast country. Let's imagine that some kind of a ceasefire and a very unsatisfactory settlement is reached in 2026. You're talking about a huge country that has always had problems with corruption, organized crime, in some cases, issues to do with border security. Add to that the trauma of the war that they've faced, the numbers of demobilized soldiers, people who will be dependent on the state because of their injuries and so on, and the point that Russia will, from day one, be actively interfering in Ukraine's politics. So if the EU doesn't take that seriously as its absolute security priority, we're all in real trouble.
Mm-hmm. Going a bit wider, Jonathan, where do you see opportunities for international organisations, whether it's the EU, the IMF, the G20 perhaps in the US this year? Where could they be doing some useful things? Just a little question for you.
I mean, I think that the most useful thing is to continue operating in what are likely to be very restrictive circumstances, with the United States withdrawing as the major contributor to most of these organizations and withdrawing physically for most of them. I mean, we speak today, earlier today, the State Department published a list of no less than 95 international organizations from which the United States is withdrawing immediately, including, for instance, the Center for Cyber Warfare that was based in the Baltic states, which they're leaving behind, including its participation in the Council of Europe's Venice committee that was responsible for proper elections and election monitoring in many countries. So I think it's the relevance of international institutions. It's international institutions that you mentioned not going the way of the WTO into complete irrelevance. So survival is not a very exciting proposition, but survival and remaining relevant is probably one of the key objectives for most of these institutions that you mentioned.
I want to draw out how important that is. These institutions need to survive and stay relevant. And the top table one that needs to survive and stay relevant is the UN. It's time for a new Secretary General. This new Secretary General will need to get, just some easy signatures on his permission slip to go on the field trip. He'll just need to get Trump, Xi, Putin, Kiir, and Macron to all agree for him to get appointed. I mean, it's really easy to just get your parents to sign and go on this field trip. This is no easy task, Jane. What is the role of the UN, and what kind of person could be Sec Gen to do that coalition building?
Well, you say he. There is one male candidate at the moment who has already been announced, which is Rafael Grossi, the current Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who has had to deal with Russia, the US, and others over both Ukraine and Iran. So far, he is the only male candidate because there is a strong sense coming from a lot of countries that for the 10th UN Secretary General, it would be surprising if they couldn't find any promising women candidates. And there are quite a few in the mix, including Rebecca Greenspan, the current head of UNCTAD, the economic organization, and Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile, although there's some questions after the changes in Chile. But these are just the names. The questions really are the qualities. And this person will really have to be the uber diplomat. As you say, they have to placate the P3 because any of the P5 countries, including, by the way, Britain, could veto any of the candidates. At the same time, they're going to face huge scrutiny, quite rightly, from the rest of the world and from civil society, where probably most countries in the world want someone that will be able to, at least sometimes, stand up to the big powers. So getting through the process will require a lot of ability. There's also, I think, a widespread consensus that the person needs to be seriously good at international peace and security. The current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, comes from a humanitarian background, and many feel that, of course, there are factors outside the UN's control that are causing the rise in global conflicts, but there probably are more things that the organization can do, often behind the scenes and quietly. The Secretary General might be using their good offices more to try to get some breakthroughs. So that is going to be extremely interesting. We're going to be talking much more about that in the year ahead. And I also I cannot resist plugging my upcoming event on January 17th, because we at the United Nations Association UK are hosting the current UN Secretary General for a keynote speech to mark the 80th anniversary of the General Assembly, which was held here in London on exactly 80 years ago at Methodist Central Hall, about 15 minutes from where we're sitting at RUSI. So we're going to go to that room where those delegates met with Clement Attlee in 1946. We're going to reflect on why people thought it might be a good idea to put limits on the use of force, and maybe the world would benefit from that. And we're going to talk about how the UN can work better to make sure those principles are not forgotten and remain fit for the future. So thanks for letting me do the plug. For people that are listening to this afterwards, we'll put the info in the show notes.
And I will continue that plug. Jane runs a really good event. This Methodist Central Hall is an absolutely gorgeous building. And it's a nice time to reflect on these 80 years, what has worked in terms of international coordination and what hasn't. Speaking of what has worked, we're here at RUSI. And I'd like to imagine that Britain still has the ability to play a top table ordering role. Britain was critical in the founding of the UN, of course, and Britain has been the key interlocutor between the US and Europe on things like NATO and a whole range of economic things. So Arthur, you've been a British diplomat. What can the UK do, not to constrain or block US destabilizing activities, but to advise, to cajole, to intermediate? I think that Keir hasn't gotten enough credit in the things that he has done of, why don't we get Zelensky to have another meeting after this Oval Office meeting? Why don't we get the Europeans on board, and then we're going to announce this, and we're going to triangulate that? He's getting so much flack in the press. Oh, they didn't, say that it's illegal. And it's like, well, because he doesn't want to piss off Trump when only he and Maloney can get through to Trump and the Finnish president. The Finnish president has an important role, but I mean, of the important ones, he's doing a great job intermediating. So what are your thoughts on how the UK can leverage the special relationship to help promote order?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've illustrated it very well, and let's not forget Donald Trump's mother, was born in Britain.
In Scotland.
On
one of those crazy islands.
We won't call them crazy, the beautiful Outer Hebrides.
Remind him how beautiful they are.
Yes, that's true. Yes, he
you
likes,
don't want to lose your islands.
He likes islands.
Very cold.
But it's clear that Trump genuinely, that the impact of having a state visit, of being hosted at Windsor Castle, the pomp of the royal family, all of that, it really lands with Trump. It really makes a difference. And that's, it's not just about that, because I think, there's a sort of cliche that Britain's royal family is sort of the only thing we've got. But actually, if we think more broadly about particularly the soft power institutions that Britain has that people still take very seriously, whether we're talking about the BBC now, Trump is currently suing the BBC. Well, is he still? I don't know. But if we're thinking beyond just Donald Trump, but actually the UK's ability to play that sort of top table global role, I think if we can think about the BBC, we can think about other institutions in sort of soft power and the cultural sense. I do think, though, because I'm not going to get away without being a little bit sort of critical. I think the fact that Britain spends about as much on its foreign affairs as it does on Kent County Council is questionable. Everybody is probably aware in this room, because it's a very well-informed room, that the Foreign Office is going through one of the biggest retrenchments it ever has in its history. Now, a country that has left the European Union and that is facing the uncertainties of the world in 2026, deciding to take a sort of chainsaw to its diplomatic service, I think is quite extraordinary. We have a smaller diplomatic service from France than from Italy, than from Germany. Are we being serious? In my opinion, we aren't.
Given this shrinking military, shrinking diplomatic service, a fairly unpopular government, we have to speak about the other 7,000-pound gorilla waiting in the room, and that's Farage, waiting in the wings, hovering over in the background. Can Britain really play this convening role when everyone knows it's not just 2029 that there's going to be a change? There could be an implosion of the current government. And what made Starmer strong in the first part of 2025 was his 80-seat majority and his, I'm here. Do you know what I mean? Macron may be gone in a minute, but I'm the one who's here. Is he already lame duckified? And how can the current government, in your mind, Arthur, in a way, Farage-proof some of Britain's role in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the lame duck issue doesn't really hold here, because obviously what we don't have is a presidency and a legislature on different elections. So I'm not saying that I know that Starmer will continue to be Prime Minister to the next election, but only a very foolish Prime Minister would call another election right now. I think with Farage, the worst case scenario is that you have a wave of these right-wing populist governments sweeping through Europe, many of which are very, shall we say, Moscow curious, to put it mildly. And Farage, he's already said, for example, that British troops shouldn't be involved in policing some kind of ceasefire in, or not even policing, a tripwire force in Ukraine, which is a fairly minimal role. Farage famously, the world leader he most admires is Vladimir Putin, although I'm sure he would now correct himself and say that Trump and then Vladimir Putin. So we have all those problems. Having said all of that, just for example, one of the things that probably will happen in 2026 is Britain improving the connectivity economically that we have with the European Union. Now that's a classic, yes, which would be a good thing, would be good for our economy, good for all kinds of reasons, good for people doing business and so on. Now that's a classic thing that on paper one would imagine that Farage is opposed to this, because of course he is opposed to all things European. But if the British economy is growing slightly quicker and British farmers are happier, many of whom may well be planning to vote reform, because it's easier for them to export their commodities to Europe. I think Farage is quite capable of taking wins where he sees them. So this is not me saying we have nothing to fear from Nigel Farage, but I think he may prove, even he may prove willing to be slightly pragmatic about some things.
Well, I like to take a win wherever I can find it. So I hope that you feel we have, to some minor extent, ordered the disorder, or at the very least merely explained how much disorder is likely in 2026. It's been a tour de force. I hope that you guys have all enjoyed hearing from Jonathan, Jane, and Arthur as much as I have enjoyed hosting them.
Thank you.
If you've liked today's program, please subscribe to the Disorder Podcast. It's something that you can get wherever fine podcasts are purveyed, meaning Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere else. Check out the link in the show notes to find out more about today's episode, such as things that Jane, Arthur, and Jonathan have written about these topics. And subscribe to the Ordering the Disorder Substack, where we try to give more information and ways of seeing order amidst the disorder of our world. So, as always, our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough, who's joining us. Thank you, George. And we've really enjoyed this partnership with RUSI in 2025. So we're hoping in 2025 and 2026, we're hoping to have more live events for mega orderers in the upcoming months, be they at the UN organization, as I mentioned, or the Frontline Club. We look forward to seeing you then. And as always, what do we wish the mega orderers, Jane?
A very orderly week.